All right, let's get started. Excited to be at the .NET Foundation Summit again. This is the third time that I've presented at the .NET Foundation Summit. The summit is a great opportunity for open source maintainers of .NET projects to be able to showcase their work to the broader .NET community. Today, I am going to show you Oqtane, which is a CMS and application framework for Blazor and .NET MAUI. I'm Shaun Walker. I guess my claim to fame is that I was the original creator of .NET Nuke, which was an open source content management system and framework that was based on web forms. It was originally released way back in late 2002, early 2003. That open source project is still around today. A lot of folks still use it for powering their websites or their web applications. But over time, the technology platform there has started to age a bit. And so that's why I created a newer open source project called Oqtane, which is based on modern .NET technology and has some of the same kind of capabilities that .NET Nuke had. I've been fortunate enough to be a Microsoft MVP for, I think it's 17 years now. So it's been a huge portion of my career, and it's always a great honor to be a Microsoft MVP. I'm also an ASP Insider, and I've also been a volunteer with the .NET Foundation since it started in 2014. For the last 5 years, I've been contributing to the project committee. The project committee reviews applications for .NET open source projects so that they can become members of the .NET Foundation. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about Blazor today, and I thought that it might be useful to do a little walk down memory lane when it comes to Microsoft technology stacks, just to remind everyone sort of how Blazor fits into the bigger picture. So if we look at .NET Web UI and the frameworks that Microsoft has provided over time, we can go all the way back to the year 2000. And that was the year, obviously, that the .NET Framework 1.0 was released. And part of .NET Framework was a UI framework called ASP.NET Web Forms. ASP.NET Web Forms was a component-based UI framework, which was very popular and very powerful. And it had a whole ecosystem of third-party vendors that created components for it. It was very powerful technology for building websites and for building web applications. And it is, it's had a very long run now. It's been around for 25 years. It is still fully supported by Microsoft, but for the last 10 years, it hasn't really been evolving or being enhanced. It's sort of been in maintenance mode as Microsoft moved to other UI frameworks since then and for their investments. In 2007, Microsoft introduced Silverlight, which was a rich UI framework, which was their competitive offering to other options such as Flash or Flex that were available at that time. A lot of applications were built using these types of technologies, but I guess it was around 2010 or 2011 that the device manufacturers such as Apple basically decided that they sort of did not like the characteristics of these types of applications on how they ran on their devices. They claimed that there might be security issues or performance issues that they would create. And so because of that, they kind of limited their ability to work on those devices. And as a result of that, it kind of was the end of these frameworks like Silverlight. And so people who had built Silverlight applications could continue on for a period of time, but really they had to migrate to other technology options at that point. And that one sort of was end of life. In 2009, Microsoft announced ASP.NET MVC. Again, this was sort of in response to developer trends in the industry. Ruby on Rails had emerged as a very popular option using the MVC approach for developing server-side applications. So Microsoft introduced ASP.NET MVC, and using a lot of the more modern techniques for software development at that time. And MVC is still around today and is still widely used for building server-based applications. Often it is paired with maybe a JavaScript UI front end, and MVC could be used on the back end, although MVC is, of course, perfectly capable of building UI as well. Over time, the MVC framework became quite large and powerful and complex. And so in 2017, Microsoft introduced Razor Pages as an alternative for basically simplifying the development approach for building applications. It was still a server-side model, but it was much more simple than the MVC approach. And that approach is still around and supported as well today. In 2018, Microsoft released Blazor as a new UI framework that was based on component-based concepts, whereas like the previous ones, Razor Pages and ASP.NET MVC were really not, like did not have a rich component model to them. Blazor did, and so if you look at the sort of graph here, Blazor's been around for 7 or 8 years now. So a lot of great investments have gone into that framework, and during that time, it has become very feature rich and mature. So it's a great UI framework, and I think it was around 2023, maybe .NET 8, that Microsoft basically made an announcement that all of the future investments around UI frameworks were going to go into Blazor, that it would become the sort of the official UI framework going forward for the future investments. And that was because Blazor is super versatile, right? It can be used to build web applications, it can be used to build desktop applications and mobile applications. So you got a lot of flexibility there. And so because of that, it seemed like it was sort of the winner when it came to UI frameworks for building applications in the future. We looked at the Blazor roadmap for a moment. As I mentioned, it's been around for 7 or 8 years. It was originally introduced in 2018, and at that time it was given sort of an experimental label, meaning that Microsoft was kind of working on it internally as a sort of a proof of concept. And they were trying to determine whether or not it was something that could be built into something that was more robust, that could be like a go-to UI framework for developers in the .NET space. By late 2019, they made the decision that yes, it was very capable and could satisfy the needs of .NET developers, and they rolled it into .NET Core 3.1, I believe, at that time. And so then it became an official UI framework that was being offered by Microsoft. The first version of Blazor in 2020 that was introduced used the Blazor server hosting model. Blazor server utilizes WebSockets or like SignalR under the covers for doing communication between the client application and the server. It was a very powerful model, still widely used today. Microsoft followed that up with Blazor WebAssembly, and WebAssembly is based on the international sort of standard around like WebAssembly technology that has emerged in the industry. So this is Microsoft's implementation of it, and it really allows .NET assemblies to be transferred to the browser and then run natively within the browser. And this, obviously, all of the main modern browsers all support it. And so it's a very powerful option if you want to run native applications in the browser. A few years after that, Microsoft introduced Blazor Hybrid. Essentially, Blazor Hybrid is an approach to extending the technology to run on mobile and desktop, and that is done by using a web view component, which can be embedded in a desktop or mobile application. And then within that web view, your Razor components can be rendered, and they're rendered natively on the device. And those web components, or sorry, those Razor components that are Blazor components, in fact, the same component that works in a web context can run in either desktop or mobile, as long as you build them in a sort of client-server architecture type approach. And then the next major advancement in Blazor was in .NET 8, which was in late 2023, and that was when Microsoft introduced static Blazor, sometimes referred to as static server-side rendering. And essentially, with this capability, it covered the more sort of server side workload of if you were maybe wanting to create a website and you had static web pages, you could use Blazor Razor components to build static applications and static websites at that point. And so with all these different capabilities, it's, like I said, a very robust and versatile technology that can be used for almost anything. Underpinning Blazor is the Razor component model. And Razor components have like sort of a full featured set of capabilities that you would imagine that any sort of component technology would have. The components themselves have UI markup, which would be a combination of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And then those are paired usually with a C# class where you would write, the functionality of your component in C#. The C# class can also provide access to lifecycle events that you can hook into to take advantage of various aspects of the component lifecycle. There's property bindings that you can very easily reference, UI elements from your C# code in the UI markup. And then there's events that can be raised as well. For example, if someone clicks a button or takes sort of interactive steps on the UI, those events can be captured within your C# code, and then you can take action on them. So very powerful component model. And this component model is consistent across all of the different render modes. So it makes it very powerful for creating components that can be used in many different devices and contexts. I already mentioned a bit about this, but the Blazor hosting models, you have Blazor Server. And Blazor Server, basically the components run on the server. But the interactivity when the components are rendered in the browser is done using WebSockets or using basically SignalR to transfer both the events back and forth between the browser and the server, and also the UI fragments that need to be rendered. And so that's a very powerful approach. It's great for internal applications, and it's very, very responsive. And then you have Blazor WebAssembly, and Blazor WebAssembly uses the WebAssembly standard, and it allows you to transfer your .NET assemblies to the browser where they'll run natively in the browser itself. And then Blazor Hybrid, using the WebView component, which can be embedded in desktop or mobile applications and allows you to run Blazor components natively on various devices. And so, as I mentioned, with the combination of these different capabilities, you can target different types of workloads or scenarios or different devices. So if you want to, build a mobile application using Blazor, you would use the Blazor hybrid approach. If you want to build a web application, you can use Blazor Server, Blazor WebAssembly, or the static server-side Blazor approach that was introduced in .NET 8. And if you want to build a desktop application, again, you can use Blazor Hybrid with the WebView concept. And so, and the cool thing is you could actually build sort of one set of Blazor components that could run on all of these different devices, as long as you architect your application appropriately in a client-server manner. All right, so with all of that background related to Blazor, now I'm going to move on to talking about Oqtane. So Oqtane is a content management system and application framework that was built from the ground up to take advantage of the capabilities of Blazor and .NET MAUI. The tagline for Oqtane is build applications, not infrastructure. And what I mean by that are a lot of modern architectures tend to use a very distributed approach where there's many, many different aspects of the application that taking advantage of different types of infrastructure. In a lot of cases, that is way more complex than it needs to be. A lot of business problems need to be solved or can be solved in a much more simple manner, where you can build an application that uses far less infrastructure, costs a lot less to run, and is a lot easier to maintain. And so that's the approach that Oqtane takes. sometimes people refer to these types of applications as modular monoliths, or there's a lot of different terminology that's used, but essentially it's trying to solve the problem of building applications in a much more simple manner. And so one of the pet peeves that I had about .NET and .NET Core and kind of the newer .NET capabilities is that the examples that are provided by Microsoft, for example, like the Blazor template, when you spin up a new application using Blazor, the capabilities that it kind of offers to the developer in terms of coming up to speed and learning are very limited, right? It offers like a few simple components where you can see some interactivity, but there's like no data access, there's no services, there's like nothing that resembles a real software application. And so that makes it difficult for developers when they're trying to learn a new technology like Blazor. And so what I wanted to do with Oqtane is provide an open source application that actually has a lot of the capabilities that you would need to use in a real world application, right? Like basically a way or patterns that you could follow for data access, patterns you can follow for building services, and how Blazor interacts with all of those things. So there's a lot of great examples that are included in Oqtane, and so that was one of the main requirements that I had when building it. Um, Oqtane is an application framework, which means that it's designed to accelerate the development of applications. So it provides a lot of building blocks that you can take advantage of so that you can focus on solving your specific business problem as opposed to, building, plumbing or, foundational things that probably every application requires, but you shouldn't be building every time from scratch. So that automation and reduction of overhead can really accelerate your development efforts, where you can focus your time on the things that matter. Code reusability is super important, especially when it comes to component models. So you can build components once and then reuse them throughout your application, as opposed to, having to rebuild functionality in various areas of your application. So I'm a real big proponent of code reusability. That was also a big factor in .NET Nuke and the web forms model. So allowing basically to build reusable components that you can reuse throughout your application, and then taking it even beyond that so that people can build reusable basically applications that you can embed within your own application. In Oqtane and in .NET, and we call these modules. And a module is essentially can be made up of many different Razor components to satisfy or basically deliver on a very specific business problem. Like, for example, if I wanted to build a blog module, right? So all of the functionality that a blog contains can be wrapped up into a module. It can be packaged in a NuGet package. It can be made available to other developers, and they can consume that into their application very simply, and then have a full-featured blog within their Blazor application. So that's what I mean by code reusability. Modular applications, like I said, they're like building blocks, but the idea with making things modular is that the various aspects of the application can be developed, they can be debugged, and they can be deployed independently from one another. So they're not all sort of commingled together. And then at runtime, they're actually dynamically instantiated and then rendered into the UI based on configuration that the application maintains for you. And some people might say, oh, well, the default Blazor approach also is modular, but because it uses components. And that's true to some extent, but in the standard Blazor application model, when it comes to deployment, you always need to deploy your entire application, even if you've modified only like one minor part of it. And so that can be a limitation because applications can become quite large, and having to, deploy the entire application isn't always the most efficient thing to do. And so with Oqtane, we wanted to solve that problem. And so modules are broken down into smaller components that are maintained independently from the framework itself. And so if you make a change to a module, you can deploy only that module without having to deploy the actual framework itself or any of the other modules that are part of it. So that's a very powerful model. And then obviously performance is a huge factor in software applications. And I guess the really cool thing is that .NET Core has always focused on performance ever since it was initially introduced. And I think in every new version of .NET Core, that has been released, there's been a continuous focus from Microsoft on performance. And so you'd find that, like, for example, .NET 6 was highly performant, but then they came out with new enhancements in .NET 7 to even push it further, and .NET 8 was, even more powerful. And so Octane gets the benefit of all of these performance benefits, but also focuses on performance itself to ensure that all of the workloads that run within the Octane application are also highly performant. And Blazor plays a key role in that because the Blazor UI component model is basically a single page application model, which allows you to emulate like desktop or that type of almost like desktop UI interactivity within a web application. So no full page refreshes, like things are very responsive and end users get the benefit. The Octane framework, like I said earlier, it accelerates your development effort by giving you a really robust foundation and platform to build on, where you can focus on your specific business problems. And it gives you a lot of building blocks. So services that are common in every application that are already wired up for you and are really easy to use, and also integrated with a pretty powerful dashboard so that you don't have to build any of that yourself. It's an open source project offered under standard open source license. That's the MIT license, which is a very permissive open source license. And in fact, the Octane framework is copyright by the .NET Foundation. It's a .NET Foundation project, so it's managed within the .NET Foundation itself. And I mean, ever since the beginning, it is pioneering the adoption of .NET Core, Blazor, and .NET MAUI. From an architecture perspective, Octane is a client-server application. If we focus on the bottom of this diagram first, we can see that it's running on using .NET Core and EF Core as its sort of main technologies from the Microsoft stack that it depends on. Octane has its own repository layer, which is used to interact with the database because it of course does require a database for storing configuration. It has a robust headless API layer as well. And because it is a client-server application, it needs to have an API. That API is also paired with Swagger for testing and other benefits. Octane also has the ability to host scheduled jobs on the server. It uses the .NET Core I hosted service interface so that those jobs basically can run within the context of an app service or a website. And again, by using this approach, it requires less infrastructure, which was one of the overall benefits of Octane, right? Build applications, not infrastructure. And then you, of course, can have your module, your independent module APIs also on the server. On the client side, it uses Blazor, and that supports, Blazor Server, Blazor WebAssembly, and Blazor Hybrid. And in fact, it also supports server or static server-side Blazor. So all of the different flavors of Blazor are supported. It has a service layer, which are basically wrappers which allow you to call the APIs on the server much more simply. It has a composable component UI, meaning that you can define as many pages as you want in your site using configuration. And then the various modules that are part of those pages are also part of the configuration. And at runtime, it'll compose the page for you dynamically based on, what your configuration says. It is multi-tenant, meaning once you have an installation of Oqtane, you can have multiple sites that are running in that installation. And each site can have its own set of users, its own set of like security roles, its own files, its own content. And so it can be, separated. Even each site can have its own dedicated database as well. And so a lot of capabilities there. And then on the UI, also on the client side, you also have the module UIs, which are, the Razor components that would be used to build modules. And with this whole sort of combination, of course, you can target many different types of devices. The multi-tenant configuration is pretty powerful. So .NET Nuke, when I created it, one of its, huge capabilities that people took advantage of was multi-tenancy. .NET Nuke only really supported one type of multi-tenancy, and that was the shared model, where you would have, an application running and you could spin up various sites that were part of the installation, but all of the data would be stored in a single shared database. In Oqtane, we've taken this a step further, and so we actually have sort of these three different multi-tenant configurations. On the left side, you've got dedicated tenancy, which is really not multi-tenant. That's where you install, the application for a single client, and you have, its own dedicated database. On the far right-hand side, you've got the shared model, which I just described, which .NET Nuke supported, and also Oqtane supports, meaning like if you want to have the data for various clients all shared in the same database to kind of reduce cost or make your infrastructure a bit more simple, you can do that. But we also have this model in the middle where you can have an installation of Oqtane, which is shared across multiple clients, but each client has their own isolated database. This is important when it comes to certain environments where there's regulatory concerns around data where you have to keep things separated. It also has other benefits in terms of when portability. If you want to move one client's data from one environment to another, it's all self-contained in its own isolated database. So there is like a lot of capabilities here around the multi-tenant configuration for Oqtane. And really multi-tenancy is one of the huge features of Oqtane because Microsoft doesn't really provide any multi-tenant capabilities as part of their own frameworks that they provide. So you do have to, either build your own or you have to take advantage of multi-tenant capabilities that are in other frameworks like Oqtane. Oqtane also has multiple database support, and this was important because obviously .NET Core is a cross-platform technology. And so on various platforms, there are different databases which are, more preferred or more popular than others. Like, for example, on Windows, a lot of .NET developers use Microsoft SQL Server. That's been the case for a long time. But on Linux or other non-Windows environments, developers like to use other databases such as MySQL, Postgres. These are all very capable relational databases, and so it was important that Oqtane could function appropriately in all these different environments. And SQLite is a great option for quickly spinning up a database in a development environment. And Oqtane supports that as well. From a security perspective, Oqtane has quite a lot of capabilities in this area as well. For anyone who's had to build, a .NET or Blazor application from scratch, wiring up the security can be quite confusing at times. I think over time, Microsoft's tried to make this a bit easier by including some self-hosted authentication capabilities in the .NET Identity Library. Like the initial versions of Blazor didn't have that, and so there was very limited options which developers had, and so Oqtane stepped in to try and fill that void with a solution. And even in today's version of Blazor, where there is some .NET identity scaffolding that can be done, the capabilities that Oqtane provides are far more advanced than what Microsoft provides out of the box. So you've probably heard of the back-end for front-end model. Essentially, for quite a number of years, the industry moved towards using like JOT tokens for everything when it came to authentication. But in probably the last 3 or 4 years, there's quite a number of limitations that have been identified related to JOT tokens, and the industry has kind of moved back towards cookies for web applications because cookies just have naturally better aspects when it comes to security. And instead of referring to it as cookies, usually they'll refer to it as backend for front-end security architecture. So Oqtane has the ability to have self-hosted authentication, and that is using the .NET Identity Library, right, where the data itself is stored within the database, and there's like an ASP.NET user table, and the standard .NET identity capabilities. Oqtane has its own user interface of components that were developed against that library, which kind of offer additional capabilities over and beyond what Microsoft provides in its own UI. Oqtane also has the ability to interact with third-party identity providers. So maybe something like Microsoft Entra, or basically any third party that offers the integration capability as an identity provider can be configured in Oqtane. And so users can log in using the identity provider. That is then transferred into a cookie, and that works really well for managing the needs of users in your application. Oqtane also supports both external clients using JOT tokens and remote APIs using JOT tokens. So it's got quite a robust security model to basically satisfy almost any scenario that you might run into. It has a composable component UI. And so I kind of described this earlier, where when you're building things in Oqtane, you're not building like physical hard-coded kind of page components. Everything is basically configuration. So everything is virtual, and that allows you to create kind of an unlimited number of pages in your site just using configuration, and those pages can contain an unlimited amount of content in various configurations. And the really powerful thing with the composable component UI is, if you need to make a content change to one particular page, you can actually make that kind of a change just by altering the configuration, as opposed to having to physically change code and do a full deployment of the application. So it can be quite efficient from that perspective. Modules in Oqtane follow the same exact architecture that the framework itself, the Oqtane framework itself, follows. So it's broken down into basically 3 projects. There's a server project, which handles the data access and repositories, the APIs. It has a shared project, which contains the models, and then it has a client project, which is where your Razor components reside, and your client services, which interact with the APIs. And all 3 of these projects then are compiled into their own assemblies, and they're packaged into a NuGet package, which allows them to be installed into your Oqtane framework instance, or even someone else's Oqtane framework instance, because the idea behind modules is they can be shared and they're very portable. Oqtane is fully localized. So the UI was built in such a way that you can localize the text of the various aspects of the UI into different languages. And there is a whole community of folks that are using Octane that have created localizations. We call them translations. And they follow the same sort of modular approach, meaning a full translation for a language, for example, maybe in French, is packaged up as a NuGet package that you can consume into your installation, and it'll install all of the like satellite assemblies that are needed. And then you just have to, within the UI, choose that you're using that particular language, and all of the labels within the application will um, dynamically transform into that other language. So localization was a key capability that was part of .NET Nuke as well, in terms of pulling in the international community so that the software could be used in many, many different regions around the world. Like, what I mean by not just English speaking regions, but non-English speaking regions as well. And so it was important that Octane contains that capability as well. The open source project, the open source project was started in 2020, so it's been around 5 years now. Very happy to say that there's been a lot of participation in the open source project. We've had about 57 or more contributors during that time, so people contributing code to the project. We've got a decent number of stars. 7,280 commits at this point in time. That's like fairly significant amount of work that's gone into this project, and 3,266 pull requests. So the .NET Foundation tracks like sort of the monthly activity of open source projects that are part of the foundation, and keeps track of kind of these different metrics. And often Octane is one of the, well, usually it's in the top 5 of most active projects within the .NET Foundation. And that just kind of speaks to how much actual, work and investment is going into this product to improve it over time. Octane also has a marketplace. And so, like I mentioned earlier about the fact that modules can be packaged as NuGet packages and made available to others, that can be done in a open source scenario, but it can also be for commercial purposes, right? So there are people who are building commercial modules and themes for Octane. And all of those extensions are made available through the Octane marketplace, which is at www.octane.net. And so it's really simple for a third-party developer to, create a module or a theme, and then they can register it in the Octane marketplace, and they can specify whether it's open source or commercial. If it's commercial, Octane also provides a kind of a integrated licensing capability as well that developers can take advantage of instead of having to like kind of roll their own licensing solution. And on the back end, the e-commerce for the marketplace is handled using Stripe. So using like an industry kind of standard e-commerce approach. And so, yeah, that provides a lot of capabilities for users of the platform to get additional functionality without having to build it themselves, right? They can leverage things that are already built. And so, like I mentioned, Octane has a lot of capabilities, right? It's multi-tenant, it's multi-language, it can support multiple devices. It supports multiple types of authentication, which I'll demonstrate in a moment. And it's cross-platform because it's built on .NET Core. It also supports multiple integrated development environments. So you can, develop with Visual Studio, you can develop with VS Code, you can develop with Cursor, you can develop with Rider. It's not tied to one specific IDE. It's extensible. So basically every feature that's built for Octane is extensible, meaning that it's expected, that developers will need to customize the application, and so there needs to be extension points that they can take advantage of so that they don't have to modify the core framework itself. Because that's the whole idea here is with a framework, as long as you don't alter the framework, right, you can upgrade the framework to newer versions to take advantage of new features without affecting your custom code that you've built, because your custom code is developed separately from the framework itself. just like Blazor. And so that's the approach that Oqtane takes. As I mentioned, it supports multiple databases. So it supports SQL Server, SQLite, MySQL, and Postgres. And it also supports all of the different Blazor render modes and hosting models that are available today, meaning it can support static Blazor, which is really powerful if you're building a website, or it can support interactive Blazor if you're building a web application. And on the interactivity side, it can support Blazor Server or Blazor WebAssembly. And then it also allows you to use the components that you write in .NET MAUI using Blazor Hybrid. Oqtane has multiple personalities, right? Because I've mentioned a few times now that you can build web applications or websites. And so it really depends, what your needs are. A lot of people are using Oqtane to build, full-featured web applications, right? Which are very interactive in nature. But then sometimes people just want to build a simple website that has a lot of static content in it, and they all want to take advantage of, the ability for people to be able to log in as content editors and use the security model so that, you can specify that some people can edit certain pages and others cannot. But the main activity that those people are performing is just managing the content on the kind of static website. And so Oqtane can be used for both. And in fact, I mean, I have these domain names reserved for Blazor Kit and Blazor CMS to kind of differentiate between the two different personas that are available within Oqtane. But actually, a lot of people also you can use kind of a hybrid approach, right? Because your web application may still have areas of it which require static content. And so that's why it makes sense to have both of these capabilities as part of the same application. If we talk about the roadmap for a minute, so the initial proof of concept of Oqtane was released in November of 2018. And that was when Blazor was still in a preview state, right? It wasn't experimental anymore, but it was, it hadn't been even released officially as part of .NET Core yet. And then the open source project for Oqtane was launched in 2019. And so that's when the open source project was first created. The initial framework code was uploaded. The community could get involved. In May of 2020 was the official launch of Oqtane 1.0, and that was on .NET Core 3.2. And then we've sort of ever since followed the release schedule of .NET itself. So every time there was a major release of .NET, we would have a major release of Oqtane. And so you'll see that, and usually that would happen, in November of each year. Microsoft has .NET Conf, and that's when they typically release a new version of .NET. There was only like 1 year with .NET 7 that things were a little bit off of that schedule. But you'll see we had Oqtane 2 with .NET 5, Oqtane 3 with .NET 6, and so on. It was suggested earlier this year that it would make it easier for people to understand the versioning scheme if we actually aligned with .NET. So basically this coming week will be the release of .NET 10, and we are going to release Oqtane 10 as well. So from this point forward, the major version of Oqtane will reflect the major version of .NET that it's intended to run on. All right, now let's shift over and do a bit of a demonstration. All right, so I have the Visual Studio 2026 Insider version installed because I've been working on the .NET 10 migration, which we're going to be releasing this week. I have the latest code from the dev branch, from the Oqtane Framework dev branch loaded up here. You'll see that there's 3 projects, right? There's an Oqtane client project, an Oqtane server project, and an Oqtane shared project. The client project has all of the Razor components, and it has all of the services as well. The server project has the APIs, the controllers, it has the repositories, it has the scheduled jobs, it has, all of the backend functionality. And then the shared project just has some, shared capabilities, the main thing it has is the shared models, which are shared between the server and the client. If we go ahead and we run this application, we're going to see the sort of default look and feel of Oqtane. So it has its own sort of default theme out of the box, and then it installs with a certain amount of content. I can go ahead and I had already created an account previously, so I can log in using the account that I created, and this would be the self-hosted auth capability that I was talking about. So if I log in as the host user, I now have an additional page that's displayed here, this private page, which is only available to people who are logged into the site. Similarly, on this home page, there was a region of the page which is only visible to people who are logged in, and so that wasn't visible when I was logged out. It has a My Page capability, so if you want to have like a portal-like capability where each user, each person who's logged in can have their own page that they can customize, it has that capability as well. If we go to the home page and I click this pencil icon, we go into what we call edit mode, and in edit mode you can see the different regions of the page. Like there's a whole bunch of different content regions which have been defined. And then this default pane, we call them panes, has different types of content in it. So this one at the top here would be an instance of a module, which manages the welcome to Oqtane content. And then there's the license, which is a separate content instance. And if I go in to edit the content, you'll see that we can edit it directly within the UI. This is the Radzen text editor, which is the default editor that we're using, which is a very powerful, rich text editor. So that was really helpful for users who are kind of non-technical. All of the different versions of changes that you make to the content are stored as well. So there's full versioning for the HTML text content. And so that's how you can make changes to your site very simply. If you want to add additional pages to your site, you go into the control panel and you can add pages or edit the configuration of existing pages, remove pages. You can also add modules to an existing page. And then you have this admin dashboard capability. And the admin dashboard allows you to get access to a whole lot of functionality that is provided by Oqtane by default. So the configuration of this particular site would be in site settings. And so we can specify, what page is our home page, what default time zone is the standard time zone that users are interacting from. It gives you information around the site map for this particular site. You can specify a custom theme. Maybe I'll change that for right now. So right now we're using the Oqtane theme, which is the default theme. There's also a Blazor theme, so we can make this look like the Blazor application that people are used to. And so just by changing the theme, right, the site is completely changed to look like the Blazor theme. And what else is in site settings? Lots of, like, you can change the rich text editor. You can specify your SMTP settings, for sending emails. You have progressive web application support. You can specify the URLs that the site is available on. And this UI component settings area is an important one because it basically says that by default, this site is using static render mode. So most of the pages in the site are static in nature. But for those areas which are interactive, it's going to be using the server interactivity, meaning SignalR, like Blazor server. And specifying whether or not the pages need to be, or the components need to be pre-rendered, and whether or not the site supports the hybrid model or not. And so you have these configuration options on every site. And I'll show you in a moment here. If I go into the admin dashboard and I go into site management, this is where all of the different sites that are part of this installation would be set up. If I want to add another site, we'll just create a test site, and we're going to make it available on this URL. So the local host with the port number, and then /test. So this will be the unique URL that this site's available on. We'll use the Oqtane theme as the default. We'll use static render mode, but we can specify different render mode if we want to. And again, we'll use the default site template. And in this case, we're just going to store the information in the same shared database. If I wanted to create a new database to store the information for this new site I'm creating, I can create the database here. I'm going to create it in the shared database. So if I say save, it'll create the new site. And so this is a new site that's available at this URL/test. And if I go back into my admin dashboard, site management, I can see I have 2 sites now that are part of this installation. I can browse back to the original site, or I can go to the new site. And we'll notice that each of these sites has their own distinct set of pages, their own set of users, their own set of security roles, files. They have basically a full set of features that are distinct and like for that specific site. So we've talked about site settings. You can, configure various aspects of the pages that are part of your site as well. So you've got the full list of pages that are scaffolded by default for you. You've got user management, where the set of users that are in this site would be available. And as an administrator, I can go in and I can manage them. So for example, if I needed to reset somebody's password, I could do that, or manage their security roles, I could do that. This type of a rich kind of robust user management area is not something that's part of the standard scaffolded like UI identity framework. So this is where Oqtane goes much further in terms of providing a real good user management functionality. Profile management, I can actually go in and I can specify the user profile fields dynamically that I want to be able to manage for my users. And it's completely dynamic, so I can add as many different fields as I want or remove the fields that are here. And then those will be appear in the user's profile. So this is the user profile for the host user that I'm logged in as. And this is where those fields are displayed that you've defined in the profile management. You got role management, where you can define different roles. You can define sort of an unlimited number of roles, and then you can assign those roles to the content management capabilities within the framework. You have a full file manager where you can create folders and upload files and specify the permissions of who's allowed to view or edit different files. Recycle bin is for pages or modules that have been deleted. URL mappings are for especially really helpful if you're migrating from another platform to Oqtane. You can specify your URL mappings so that you don't have broken links or 404s, right? They're going to be mapped to particular URLs which are part of this site. You can track visitors. There's a whole search engine that's part of Oqtane, which is tied in with the content. And that's where the search box up at the top kind of comes from, but there's a lot of configuration options around that. You can have multiple languages. So this would be the translations that I was talking about earlier. So you can specify that this site, supports multiple languages. You've got an event log where all of the different events that happen within the Oqtane framework are logged. That could be that could be errors, but also other types of events. And it'll give you, the full details for, when things happened, which user was responsible, various information that's quite helpful. We talked about site management. Module management are where the modules, so by default, we have this HTML text module, but we also have a bunch of admin modules as well that are available. If you want additional modules, you can say that I want to install a module, and these modules that are surfaced here are from the Oqtane marketplace. And if I want to install one of these, I can just click download and it'll download it as a NuGet package, which will then can be installed immediately and usable within your environment. You can also create a module, and by providing some basic information, it'll scaffold the code that's necessary to build a module for Oqtane. So giving you a complete starting point of a functional module that you can build. Similarly, you have that capability for themes. Themes are what define the look and feel of the site. And so you can create your own themes or downloaded themes that already exist. You have your scheduled jobs area, where you have, scheduled jobs which are running. For example, by default, we have a notification job, which there's a notification API that modules can create messages in, and then it runs asynchronously and sends out those messages as email using SMTP. We also have a sort of housekeeping purge job, which keeps, which page automatically has like retention policies for purging information out of the system to keep it performing well. And then the search index runs continuously as well, monitoring if there's new content that needs to be indexed so that it can be available within the search engine. It's got the ability to interact with your databases as well. So you can actually write SQL queries if you're, and of course I'm logged in as the host user, which is the most powerful user in the site. So SQL management is only available to the host user, not available to other types of users. But as usually when you're developing in Oqtane, you'd be logged in as the host user, and this is quite handy to have available when you're doing software development, right? If you're testing things, you might want to write a simple query to see if the data looks correct. System info tells us that we are running on Oqtane 10, which is on .NET 10, and it gives you a bunch of additional information about the environment that might be helpful, like where certain folders are, where the files are stored, and code is stored. We've got the ability to set some options, which define how errors are dealt with. There is a log as well for errors that might arise that are not part of of an individual site. And then the database migrations also have the ability to be surfaced as well, so that you can, as a developer, track down maybe where a database migration didn't run successfully. And we've got a system update capability as well, which allows you to actually update the framework automatically, much like you can in kind of WordPress. And then you have a setting management capability as well, which allows you to manage various settings that are part of the system. So huge amount of functionality that's available there. The one thing that I wanted to show you is for Oqtane 10 specifically, and in .NET 10, Microsoft introduced some new capabilities around passkeys. So if I go into the admin dashboard, actually, I'm going to switch back to my default site. And I'm going to go to the user management area. And then going to the settings. In my user settings, I have the ability now to say that, yeah, I want to use passkeys. And passkeys are sort of that whole passwordless authentication capability that is becoming more and more popular. And this was a capability that was provided by Microsoft in .NET Identity and .NET 10. And so we've integrated that into Oqtane. I guess another thing I'll show you in here is we have, like I mentioned earlier, the ability to have external login. So, for example, I have this set up so I can now log in with Microsoft Entra as well if I want to. And I have all of the configuration options available to me. So if I go back to the home page and I log out for a moment, and I say I want to log in, because I've set up Microsoft Entra, I can log in using Microsoft Entra. Previously, I logged in using the hosted authentication capability here, but I also can log in using a passkey. So first of all, let's try using Microsoft Entra. So if I say Microsoft Entra, it redirected me to the DevEssence Entra endpoint. I was already logged in there. It redirected me back, and I'm logged in as the host user because I'd already logged in previously, and I had mapped my user based on the email address. So that works well. If I log out and I go to log in and I choose use passkey, it comes up with the Windows Hello. And I know that it's this profile here that I want to use, and I say OK. And then I can enter my PIN code, and I'm logged in as the host user. So we've got many different authentication capabilities that are part of Oqtane, that are all wired up and functional, that make it really easy for developers to build applications and websites that have, modern authentication capabilities without having to build it from scratch. So that's just like one of the many capabilities that Oqtane has. And so I guess with that, I will go back to my slides, and I think I'm at the end of my time now. And so I want to thank you for allowing me to share a bit about Oqtane with you. It's a very powerful framework. It's open source, of course, and so you can go to GitHub and you can find the Oqtane framework, and you can take a look at the code. You can very easily install it, and it's all ready for .NET 10, which is going to be released here in a couple of days. So very exciting. So thanks again for having me. And if you have any questions, please send me an email.